Hello everyone, welcome to the 9th week of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. If you look at the course outline, in the first week we have discussed historical location of the idea of development. In the second week we have discussed end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world and the desire for development. In this third week, we have discussed classical sociology and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress. In the fourth, fifth and sixth weeks, we have discussed modernization theory. In the seventh week, we have discussed critiques of modernization theory. And in the eighth week, in the last week, we have discussed, in terms of 3 lectures, we have discussed the background to the Latin American debates on underdevelopment in the context of the emergence, rise and growth of the dependency theory. And in this week, in terms of 2 lectures, we are going to complete the dependency theory and then we will move on to the critiques of dependency theory in the lectures to follow. That the Latin American dependency school, when I say the dependency perspective takes shape, that the economic situation in Latin America, together with the lack of confidence in the prevailing development theories, created a sense of great confusion. In what sense? That Blomstrom and Hetney suggest that the economic situation in Latin American continent, together with a lack of confidence in the prevailing development theories, created a sense of great confusion. As you can slightly recall, in the last week we have discussed how dependency theory refers to a set of theories which maintained that the failure of the third world states to achieve adequate and sustainable levels of development, which resulted from their dependence on the advanced capitalist world, and how dependency theories developed in opposition to the optimistic claims of modernization theory, which saw that the less developed countries being able to catch up with the West, provided they emulate the social and economic systems of Western capitalism. On the contrary, the proponents of dependency theory, popularly known as the dependists, stressed that Western societies had an interest in maintaining their advantaged position through colonialism, through imperialism, in relation to the less developed countries, and had the financial and technical wherewithal to do so. It refers to, the dependency theory refers to a variety of different accounts of the relationship between advanced and less developed states, which evolved within the broader framework of dependency theory, ranging from the stagnationism and surplus trend theory of Andre Gunder Frank, that the third world would be unable to achieve significant levels of industrialization, to the more cautious pessimism of those who envisaged a measure of growth based on associated dependent relations with the West. The major contribution to dependency theory was undoubtedly that of Frank, who devised and popularized the phrase the development of underdevelopment, describing what he saw as the deformed and dependent economies of the peripheral states, in his terminology, the satellites of the more advanced metropolises. In Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America of 1969, Andre Gunder Frank argued that the third world was doomed to stagnation because the surplus that it generates is being appropriated by the advanced capitalist countries through agencies such as transnational corporations. And Frank himself insisted that growth could only be achieved by serving ties with capitalism and pursuing autocentric socialist development strategies. And this is how we have tried to capture the essence of dependency theory, the dependency approach, which originated in the extensive Latin American debate on the problems of underdevelopment. Dependency approach not only contained an effective criticism of the modernization paradigm, but also provided an alternative perspective and still functions as a catalyst in the development theory which is taking shape at present. And the dependency school, as we have discussed, emerged from the convergence of two intellectual trends, one neo-Marxism on the one hand and the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, popularly known as the Eclat tradition, on the other. The concept of neo-Marxism, as we have discussed, reflects a certain dualism in Marxist thinking, that is, on the one hand the traditional approach focusing on the concept of development and taking a basically Eurocentric view, and on the other hand a more recent approach focusing on the concept of underdevelopment, expressing a third world view. A second important background to the dependency school was the more indigenous Latin American discussion on underdevelopment, reflecting specific economic and intellectual experiences in various Latin American countries, particularly during the Great Depression of the 1930s. I mean, the Great Depression in the form of economic crisis dramatized the version of Latin American dependence, and then it initiated a more systematic economic research, and it necessitated a policy of import substitution, later systematized into a development strategy. And then we have discussed Marxism versus neo-Marxism, Marx and the third world, Marxism in Latin America, the new left in Latin America, and Paul Barron's concept of economic surplus is the way he tried to distinguish between actual surplus on the one hand and potential surplus on the other, and that led to the rise of neo-Marxism in Latin America. Then we have discussed the differences between Marxism and neo-Marxism from four vantage points, namely imperialism and nationalism, classes, revolution and ethics, and ecology. Okay. Then we have discussed Eclat development thinking through the works of Raoul Prebisch and his association with the Eclat tradition, then programmed industrialization and the Eclat theory of development. Then we have discussed the Latin American critique of the modernization paradigm through Stuyvenhagen, Cardoso, Dos Santos, Sunkel and Frank. There we have discussed Stuyvenhagen's 7 erroneous theses on Latin America, Cardoso's historical structural method, Dos Santos' foregrounding of the basic prerequisites for a more solid theory of development, Sunkel's concepts of development and underdevelopment, Sunkel's international relations and national level, and so on. And then we have discussed Frank's capitalism and underdevelopment in Latin America and the sociology of development and underdevelopment of sociology. Underdevelopment is not an original position, rather underdevelopment is a created condition. This is the background to the rise and growth of the Eclat tradition and or the dependency theory as such. Now we are going to in terms of two lectures, we are going to discuss the Eclat analysis radicalized through the works of Furtado and Sunkel, especially Sunkel's model of global dualism, Marxist influences through the works of Cardoso and Furtado, and neo-Marxist influences through the works of Dos Santos and Marini, and finally the crystallized theory of dependence through the works of Frank. And then we will move on to the critiques of dependency theory in the 10th week of this massive open online course on sociology of development. When I say the Eclat analysis was radicalized through the works of Furtado and Sunkel, before moving on to Sunkel's model of global dualism, okay, one of the most influential of the more radical Eclat theorists was Furtado. He was originally a traditional economist in the sense that he strongly emphasized lack of capital in the underdeveloped countries. Like the others associated with the Eclat, he attributed this lack of capital mainly to external factors, that is the periphery exported raw materials and imported industrial goods, finished goods, and also found the solution to the problem to be import substitution. Solution to what kind of problem? Solution to the problem of underdevelopment, okay, to be import substitution. After the rapid industrial growth in Brazil during the 1950s, he was optimistic about the future. However, his view changed soon. As director of planning of the poorest regions of Brazil, he experienced the developments leading up to the military takeover in 1964. In Furtado's analysis of this period that he wrote, which indicates that he had abandoned the earlier emphasis on the growth of productivity, what he wrote in 1965, that economic development, being fundamentally a process of incorporating and diffusing new techniques, implies changes of a structural nature in both the systems of production and distribution of income. The way in which these changes take place depends to a large extent on the degree of flexibility of the institutional framework within which the economy operates. Now, Furtado was also referring to differences between capitalist development in the center, okay, and also capitalist development in the periphery. When I say capitalist development in the center and capitalist development in the periphery, in a way that was to become typical of the dependency school. The developed countries were characterized by the fact that there was an independent relationship between purchasing power and investment, which eventually led to a general rise in the standard of living. Thus, it creates a basis for an industrial democracy in which various political forces could limit the power of the capital owners. Furtado earlier assumed that the periphery would also develop along these lines. What are those lines then? Rise in purchasing power and investment. That is how the periphery, the less developed countries would also make progress through this. But there is a condition. What is that condition? That condition is that capitalist development is possible or could be initiated by means of import substitution. Now, he claimed that the internal structure which colonialism had created in these countries was extremely rigid. The Great Depression from 1929 to 1933, for instance, had created an opportunity for Brazil to get rid of this structure, since the government inadvertently had followed a strict Keynesian economic policy. It bought large quantities of coffee, for example, which were later destroyed. By using coffee as fuel for the locomotives, domestic employment was kept up while the import possibilities were reduced. This was also an incentive for import substitution. However, the internal structure was not changed and the traditional sectors were not abolished, resulting in continued economic insufficiency and stagnation. Furtado's optimism had thus soon changed into pessimism. How? The Ekla strategy of industrialization had increased foreign dependence rather than reduced it. If Ekla's strategy of industrialization increased foreign dependence, then imported consumption goods had already been replaced by imported capital goods and intermediate products necessary to the industrial structure that had been created in Brazil. The dependence upon the export of primary products had also increased, since it alone was to pay for the imports. From this growing interest in the internal and social structure, Furtado came to the conclusion that it was obviously of great interest both to the foreign industries and to the domestic oligarchy to keep large groups of the population marginalized. And in this way, salaries could be kept down and profits up. Furtado described the social structure standing in the way of development in Brazil like this. What he wrote, that in short, the social structure can be outlined like this, that at the top is a ruling class composed of various groups of interests, in many respects antagonistic to each other. If in many respects antagonistic to each other, therefore unable to form a plan for national developments and holding the monopoly of power unchallenged. Lower down, we have a great mass of salaried urban workers employed in services, which forms a social strata rather than a proper class. Beneath, this is a class of industrial workers which hardly represents 1/10 of the active population of the country, but constitutes its most homogeneous sector, and finally the peasant masses. From this point on, Furtado left his previously rather economistic analysis in favor of a broader approach in which social structure played an important role. He then tried to combine certain parts of Marxism with Keynesian theory. According to Furtado, both Marxism on the one hand and Keynesian theory on the other had advantages and disadvantages. For example, for Marxism, it was a matter of isolating the structural insight from its unacceptable teleology. Keynes, on the contrary, had never put much emphasis on structural changes. His contribution consisted of a new useful view of the government and its role in the economy. It is interesting to see that Furtado had already touched on the problem of rigid social structures. Furtado never attempted to carry out an analysis that, when I said Furtado had already touched upon the problem of social structure, I mean contemporary Marxists often dwell on this. Although Furtado never attempted to carry out an analysis of the modes of production. When I say modes of production, I mean they are a combination of forces of production and relations of production. Furtado's approach nevertheless shows that there were dependency theorists who did not consider development in the periphery only as a reflection of what was going on in the center, which is what the dependency school is usually accused of doing. Instead, he believed in some sort of interaction between external as well as internal factors, with the emphasis on, in fact, the internal factors. Furtado then left Brazil after the 1964 military coup and moved to Paris, where he expanded his analysis to cover all of Latin America. His pessimistic aura became more pronounced. The continent's only salvation, as he saw it, lay in increased self-reliance, which was brought out quite clearly in his book Economic Development in Latin America in 1969. Here what he says, that a move towards the solution of these and other problems related to external relations would be inconceivable without a parallel effort to bring about structural reforms and create new forms of cooperation of the region. In the region, he particularly emphasized an increased public commitment. The government should strive to restructure the entire economy so that modern technology could be disseminated to all sectors of production, thus also guaranteeing a more equitable distribution of income, which in turn would put an end to social marginalization. It was also important that the Latin American countries gained a certain technological independence and that the intra-regional trade expanded. Furtado played an important role not only in the Latin American debate, but together with Andre Gunder Frank as the most important proponent of the dependency perspective outside of Latin America. Most of his works have been translated into English, French and Spanish and are thus read all over the world. When we come from Furtado to Sunkel, okay, it's interesting. Okay. The Chilean Oswaldo Sunkel is also important in the context of the radicalization of the Ekla tradition, Ekla perspective. He started his professional career as an economist during the early 1950s and has thus, together with Furtado, worked within the framework of the established paradigm and contributed to its downfall during the 1960s. Sunkel worked, as we have discussed it in the last week, okay, I mean especially the last lecture, that Sunkel worked with ECLA during the early 1960s. He left this institution of ECLA for a professor's chair at the University of Chile, where in 1966 he delivered a lecture in which he dealt with the problems of dependency, noting how it had been neglected in Latin American social sciences. He referred to the question of dependency as an area which until now has been taboo, in the sense, when I say until now has been taboo as far as serious analyses are concerned, Sunkel pointed out that dependence nevertheless had become a popular topic outside the lecture halls. He obviously intended to make this complex of problems academically respectable. He rejected the revolutionary solution which was diligently debated in radical circles. I mean, a radical socialist revolution is, in Sunkel's opinion, a highly improbable historical event in the immediate future of Latin America. His views on the Latin American bourgeois contain an entirely different air of optimism to those of the radicals, with whom we shall when we will be dealing with this, I mean when we will be dealing with Sunkel's model of global dualism, transnational integration and national disintegration, we will discuss this. Okay. Sunkel then believed in the possibility of political alliances between certain middle class groups and the poorer urban and rural strata. These new alliances, which ought not to be confused with the ones that have occurred in the past in Latin America, represent national collective interests and objectives in a better and different way from that which was the case in traditional and dual societies. Nationalism, development and organized mass participation are the ideological pillars of such alliances. Then what kind of alliance, political alliances Sunkel was referring to? Alliances, when political alliances occur, okay, he looked at nationalism, development and organized mass participation. Okay. This is certain Latin American countries, of course primarily Chile in the context of Sunkel's model of global dualism, should on the basis of these alliances be capable of carrying out a national policy of development. I mean when I say national development policy or national policy of development, I mean the nationalism of development is a force of national affirmation, an aspiration to self-determination and sovereignty, a desire to participate in the benefits and creation of modern and universal culture and science, the desire to attain liberty, democracy, equality of opportunities and well-being, which the more industrialized countries enjoy to a greater or lesser extent. Unlike Raoul Prebisch, Sunkel emphasizes the internal factors. Okay? The possibilities, I mean when I said emphasis on internal factors, I mean the possibilities of carrying out a national development policy vis-a-vis in relation to domestic situation. Okay? That is the gist of that is the gist of the radicalization of the ECLA analysis, that the possibilities of carrying out a national development policy basically depend on the domestic situation. This is really the gist of the radicalization of the ECLA analysis. The ECLA had diplomatic reasons for not wanting to touch on the sensitive subjects of the Latin American countries' domestic affairs. Compared to the dependency theorists who had been influenced by Marxism, Sunkel appears to be relatively moderate. He differs from them by being more eclectic. He does not reject Marxist theory, but works within a structuralist tradition developed by economists to which left-wing Sunkel and Pedro Paz, his collaborator in a classic development theoretical work, belonged. Unlike the ECLA theorists, Sunkel and Paz chose a broader interdisciplinary approach, while at the same time they spoke more openly about internal Latin American conditions, class contradictions and so on. Thus, Sunkel found the Marxist analysis of the historical development of imperialism to be acceptable, but argued that it had neglected to deal with that which happens within the countries subjected to imperialism. On this point, he found the theory of the so-called backwash effects of international trade developed by Gunnar Karl Myrdal in Asian Drama and other structuralist oriented economists to be at least a promising start. This theory was, however, incomplete in that it mainly dealt with the effects of trading in raw materials. Sunkel found a new form of the transnational corporations. He described the general tendency of the global system in which both developed as well as developing countries formed integral parts in terms of transnational integration and national disintegration. Now, let us see what is this. I mean, obviously the countries themselves are not the main components of this global system. This is the entire, this main circle is the capitalist system. If you look at the slide, then the upper portion of this circle is the refers to developed countries. The lower portion, the lower circle, the circle at the bottom is represents underdeveloped countries, and you will find the entire this portion, okay, this entire portion, it represents the transnational core, okay, and the ones who are not, which are not filled with colors, they represent the periphery of transnational capitalism, okay. I mean, according to Sunkel, the conventional theory of international trade makes a fundamental mistake by considering countries to be distinct units of an economic analysis or an economic system in which transactions between these units take place. The global system is instead characterized by two distinct but interacting structures. I mean, the transnational capitalism represented by the economies of most of the industrialized countries, I mean the center or the developed countries, as well as the modern sectors of the underdeveloped countries, and the regions that are peripheral to the center, as well as the much larger part of the underdeveloped countries which have been excluded from development and remain in a state of stagnation and marginalization, that is the periphery. The relations between these two structures are in turn characterized by polarization both at the international and the national level. Sunkel's model, I mean global model of global dualism is characterized by the fact that the substructures cut straight through the national boundaries. There exists a dynamic that determines the function of the whole system, and the purpose of the analysis is to understand this process. The key institution in this analysis is the transnational corporation. When I say transnational corporation, Sunkel immediately refers to the Bretton Woods twins, namely the International Monetary Fund, popularly known as the IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, popularly known as the World Bank. And now many other transnational corporations exist, but if you look at in the wake of the aftermath of the Second World War, especially these two institutions, financial institutions, they emerged, and they emerged to exploit the periphery on a more larger institutionalized scale. Okay? And Sunkel's view about the long-term process of development was pessimistic. What he wrote, that this transnational process of integration tends to intensify the process of cultural, political, social and economic underdevelopment in the peripheral nations, where it at the same time increases dependence and precipitates domestic disintegration, national disintegration. After the military coup in Chile, Sunkel continued his work on transnational capitalism and national disintegration at the University of Sussex in England. Sunkel's later thoughts on development and dependence may be found among his various writings in connection with this project, but mostly Sunkel found the Marxist analysis of historical development of imperialism to be acceptable. He adopted the structuralist method, the method of the structuralist school, which may be said to form part of the current development debate. Okay? If you look at very quickly, if we have to recapitulate what we have discussed in the context of the radicalization of the Ekla analysis through the works of Furtado and Sunkel. Okay, if you look at this very briefly, if I say this is the core or the or more advanced capitalist countries, okay, developed countries, the colonizers, the imperialists, okay, and what they do, they get raw materials, cheap labor force from the periphery. Okay, if you look at this, they all get raw materials and cheap labor force from the underdeveloped countries, from the peripheral countries, from the less developed countries. Okay? In other words, the core or the metropolises, they receive raw materials and cheap labor force from the satellites or the periphery, and in turn provide industrial goods or finished goods to the satellites. And this is how the periphery or the less developed countries or the underdeveloped countries or the satellites or the southern hemisphere becomes perennially dependent on the metropolises or the core or the center or the northern hemisphere. Okay, this is how people, very often students very often say that no, this used to happen only in the context of when we were colonized, but even today it is happening. It is not like that it is not happening today, it is also happening now. Okay, that's we talk about brain drain and so on. I mean, very very bright students from India, they go abroad because we are not able to provide adequate infrastructure, adequate equipments, technology and so on to pursue their research in our own country. That is why we talk about brain drain. Okay, that is why you will find especially the scientific policy resolution, then the scientific policy resolution of 1958, the technological policy the technology policy statement of 1983, and the science and technology policy of 2003, and then science, technology and innovation policy of 2013, and recently in 2020, I mean September 2020, the government of India has come up with the new science, technology and innovation policy. They all emphasize on this aspect, they have been emphasizing this aspect that no, we must stop brain drain, right. Instead, we must eye for brain gain. Okay. But it is even now it is an unfinished task, which I think present generation and the future generations have to really work hard to stop this, precisely because if we do not build our nation independent of imperialist yoke, independent of the intervention of the more advanced capitalist countries, then perhaps we will not be able to build our own technology, we will not be able to build our own infrastructure and so on. We will be perennially dependent on the West for our research, for our development and so on. Okay. This is briefly what a dependency theory is all about, and how it has been radicalized through the works of Furtado, through the works of Oswaldo Sunkel and so on, we have discussed. Okay. Now, if you look at why I referred to these policies, especially the scientific policy or resolution of 1958 under the leadership of Nehru and Bhabha. Okay. Bhabha was extremely important, Homi Bhabha. Okay. And an alliance that Sunkel was referring to, nationalism, that Sunkel was basically referring to nationalism, development and organized mass participation are the ideological pillars of political alliances. Okay. If you look at the scientific policy resolution of 1958, you will find an alliance was forged between science and politics, especially, and the field of science was represented by Homi Bhabha, and the field of politics was represented by Jawaharlal Nehru, and there was one more actor who also immediately came into such alliance. That is why we say the alliance between science, politics and industry, when the Tatas came to the fore. You look at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, you look at many CSIR labs and so on. There has been an alliance which has been forged between science, politics and industry. Okay. The more emphasis was laid on scientific temper and so on in the context of the scientific policy resolution. Okay. Two important things that I want to bring to your attention to, that you will find that there is a huge hiatus between building scientific temper on the one hand and building scientific institutions on the other. Perhaps through these policies, India has been able to build scientific institutions on a larger scale, but so far as building scientific temper is concerned, perhaps as a collective we have failed. Okay, one. Second thing was that we must build the culture of self-reliance. Self-reliance, please don't think that self-reliance came after independence or in 2021 or something. No. Self-reliance practically in the context of India, in the context of anti-colonial movements, Gandhi was the first to talk about self-reliance, Swaraj and so on. In Hind Swaraj, Gandhi emphatically mentioned, Mahatma Gandhi emphatically mentioned, if India copies England, it is my firm conviction that she will be ruined. Then Gandhi tried to put more emphasis on cottage industries, khadi, I mean homespun cloth, because for him khadi is the symbol of Indian humanity and civilization. That is how he tried to bring in more and more women, unskilled labor force and so on, so that you do not require so much of skill to operate a machine. Okay? You do not require high tech skill to operate machines, but just because we do not know how to operate machines, it does not imply that we should remain unemployed. Okay? Self-reliance was, I mean the concept of self-reliance was introduced by Gandhi in the context of anti-colonial movements, anti-imperialist movements, anti-British movements. Okay? Okay? But today's self-reliance, the concept of self-reliance is much different. Okay? That even if I do not know how to operate a machine, even if I do not know how to familiarize myself with modern technologies, I must be able to earn my living. I should not depend on the West, I should not depend on colonial powers for my life and living, for my livelihood, right. And therein lies the significance of the concept of self-reliance. That's why I keep on quoting Gandhi in the context of Swaraj, in the context of self-reliance, in the context of self-rule, that if India copies England, it is my firm conviction that she will be ruined. And perhaps the colonial powers, they all thought that no, if you want to make development possible, then you always have to copy the West. And perhaps Gandhi was one of the first to bring about a critique of modernization theory. When you look at his works on in Hind Swaraj, if you look at the pamphlets that he used to write in the form of Young India, that when he said that if India copies England, it is my firm conviction that she will be ruined, then it is an attack on the optimistic claims of the modernization paradigm that no, if you just copy the West, if you imitate the social and economic systems of Western capitalism, you are going to make development possible. This is an erroneous thesis by the proponents of modernization theory, by the proponents of the theories of capitalist development, the proponents of colonialism, the proponents of imperialism. And perhaps Gandhi was one of the first to recognize this flaw of colonial powers, the flaw of imperialist forces, the flaw of the theories of capitalist development, and in essence the flaws of the modernization paradigm. And Gandhi in this sense is extremely important. Okay. Anyway, we'll discuss Gandhi at length and in detail towards the end of this course, when we will be discussing after limits to growth thesis, then small is beautiful, and then especially when we will be discussing the debates within sociology of development so far as India is concerned. Okay, we will discuss Gandhi, will discuss Amartya Sen, for example, and so on. Okay, these are very important figures In fact, Gandhi and Nehru, the controversies between Gandhi and Nehru, so far as development trajectory is concerned and so on, it is extremely important. Okay? Okay. People very often used to say that, no, Gandhi is anti-science, but I always say that Gandhi's views about science, Gandhi's views about technology must be examined in the context of the anti-colonial movements that he led. When he said, no, we do not require this technology, it does not imply that he was anti-technology. He was against any kind of westernized technology, which will cripple, which would cripple the Indian economy, which would cripple the Indian society and so on. So that if we are able to critically evaluate a technology which has been imposed on us by the West, by the northern hemisphere, then we will be in a better position to build our own technology, build our own infrastructure and so on. In this sense, it is extremely important to situate Gandhi, situate Nehru, situate Tagore, for example, Rabindranath Tagore, situate Amartya Sen, for example, in perspective. Okay? Okay. In this sense, we are discussing a critique of the modernization theory and critique of modernization theory through the lens of the Latin American debates on underdevelopment and so on. Okay. Then we have, as we have discussed, the radicalization of the ECLA analysis through the works of Furtado and Sunkel. Then we have discussed Sunkel's model of global dualism through transnational integration and national disintegration. Very quickly, we will try to look at the Marxist influences so far as the Latin American dependency school is concerned. The Marxist influences, when I say through the works of Cardoso and Fallito, some of the views did not emanate directly from the ECLA tradition, but should instead be seen in the light of the Latin American Marxist tradition. Let us first examine the more traditional Marxist influences. They originated in a sociological annex to the ECLA, that is the Latin American Institute for Social and Economic Planning. After the military coup in Brazil in 1964, Cardoso moved to Chile and joined the Latin American Institute for Social and Economic Planning. Here, Cardoso and Fallito, Fallito was a historian, and as you know that Cardoso and Fallito conducted sociological and historical studies of various cases of dependency, a concept which quickly gained support among the social scientists at the ECLA tradition and at the universities in Santiago. The fact that social scientists from various parts of Latin America could discuss and compare experiences from different countries was no doubt important to the further development of the dependency perspective. Thus, it is hardly correct to tie the new ideas to one or two names alone. However, when Dependency and Development in Latin America by Cardoso and Fallito was published during in 1969, it is now considered to be one of the classics of the dependency theory debate. In contrast to the ECLA analysis, Cardoso and Fallito focused on the socio-political aspects of dependency. Only a study of the conditions of the decision making will enable us to explain why a change of economic conditions will benefit some countries but not others. In other words, both Cardoso and Fallito, they saw economic development as an expression of various combinations of class interest that vary from one historical situation to another. The way in which a dependent economy was linked to the world market was crucial. The linkage as well as the local response might vary. Thus, the dependency situation constituted a historically changing pattern. Okay? I mean, when I say historically changing pattern, I mean the complexity of which precluded all general laws of development, specifically those claiming that all countries go through certain predetermined stages of development. Nevertheless, it is possible roughly to identify certain stages of development in countries placed in similar historical circumstances, such as the Latin American countries. After they gained independence from Spain or Portugal, political power was based on an alliance between the modern commercial agrarian sector and the old economy. The new commercial elite dominated this alliance, and the economic political result was what in Latin America is called that an export oriented development based on the production of raw materials. This phase principally lasted until the Great Depression of the 1930s, which conventionally is considered to be the starting point of a more differentiated and introverted type of economic development in Latin America, or the export oriented development. From their socio-political perspective, I mean from Cardoso's and Furtado's sociological perspective, I mean they claimed that this type of development actually started much earlier. The time varied from country to country because of the rise of a new middle class, which was gradually observed by the various national power structures. Thus, the emphasis was on the power political base rather than on the external impetus, which was the same for most of the Latin American countries. However, the response changed from country to country depending on the way in which the class alliances were made up. The regime of Vargas in Brazil was, for instance, based on a compromise between the oligarchy made of sugar and coffee producers and the new urban bourgeois. Vargas' policies provided an incentive, while the coffee economy at the same time was kept alive by heavy subsidies. Colombia, for example, presented a contrasting situation. The urban interests did not succeed in acquiring any power from the traditional oligarchy. So, the positive response to the new economic opportunities consequently failed to appear. The so-called banana republics, I mean the Central American mini states, on the contrary, lacked the prerequisites for a more independent economic policy. The effects of the Great Depression were therefore purely negative. The peasants revolted in reaction to the deteriorating situation and were put down by military force. Some of the larger Latin American countries continued their line of industrialization after the Second World War. The ECLA provided the necessary arguments, but in international banking circles, the policy of import substitution was considered to be inappropriate. However, the rationale for carrying out this policy was, according to Cardoso, totally irrelevant, since it was determined primarily by the nature of the class alliances in the Latin American countries. When, for reasons, when the policy had its day and economic stagnation ensued, these alliances collapsed, as did the typical populist alliance between the bourgeois and organized labor, a fragile arrangement that served as the basis of Latin American democracy. When that could no longer be maintained, military dictatorships followed one after the other. Typical of them all was the fall of the Guwahati regime in Brazil in 1964, and that is how the military coup was there, concomitant with a new political situation where of course new economic strategies and development trends. From this account, it is quite obvious that Cardoso and Furtado represented an approach which was mainly characterized by its orientation towards concrete studies of dependency. Cardoso explicitly refrained from the formulation of a new theory and rejected on several occasions after the dependency perspective's definite breakthrough, the idea that the dependency theory should be thought of as a theory independent of the Marxist theory of imperialism. Instead, Cardoso maintained that the theory of imperialist capitalism, as is well known, has so far attained its most significant treatment in Lenin's works. However, if it was not for a relatively revisionistic attitude to basic tenets of Leninism, Cardoso would not have been considered a true dependency theorist. In spite of the accuracy of, for example, Lenin's insights as measured against historical events during the first half of the 20th century, in many parts of the world, some important changes have deeply affected the pattern of relationship between imperialist and dependent nations. And these changes demand a reappraisal of emergent structures and their main tendencies. Even if these modifications are not so deep as the shift that enabled Lenin to characterize a new stage of capitalism during the period of imperialist expansion, they are marked enough to warrant a major modification of the established analysis of capitalism and imperialism. Nevertheless, contemporary international capitalist expansion and control of dependent economies undoubtedly prove that this new pattern of economic relationships among nations remains imperialist. However, the main points of Lenin's characterization of imperialism and capitalism are no longer fully adequate to describe and explain the present forms of capital accumulation and external expansion. It is interesting to note that Cardoso considers Paul Barron's and Paul Swiggy's analysis of monopoly capitalism as a further refinement of the Marxist theory. In his opinion, a similar refinement is required to tackle the consequences of monopoly capitalism in the dependent economies. Here, Paul Barron again provides important ideas in his political economy of growth, to which Cardoso nevertheless has some objections. The important thing as far as Cardoso is concerned is that he never sees development and dependence as completely incompatible. Development of underdevelopment in Andre Gunder Frank sums up another misconception. The fact is that the assumption of a structural lack of dynamics in the dependent economies caused by imperialism is a misrepresentation of the true nature of the economic view of the situation. It is necessary to understand that in specific situations, it is possible to expect development as well as dependency. Okay? Of course, that an extreme dependency position considers development and underdevelopment to be two sides of the same coin and sees dependence as the ultimate cause of underdevelopment. Okay? Then what we have discussed in this lecture? We have discussed the radicalization of Ekla analysis through the works of Furtado and Sunkel, and especially Sunkel's model of global dualism, okay, through transnational integration and national disintegration, through the capitalist system, developed countries, underdeveloped countries, and how we tend to witness the periphery of transnational capitalism as well as the transnational core in the whole capitalist system. And then we have discussed Marxist influences through Cardoso, through the works of Cardoso and Furtado. Okay? And in the next lecture, we are going to discuss neo-Marxist influences through the works of Dos Santos and Marini, and then we'll discuss the crystallized theory of dependence through the works of Andre Gunder Frank. Okay? Thank you.